What's up, everybody? Thralls Metal here once again. I'm Necrotic Nick, and I have an album review for you. Now, before we get started, I'm just going to let you know this is going to be just me this weekend. I'm giving the guys some time to catch up on stuff that, well, we've been kind of working on, and, you know, life kind of gets in the way of that, so giving them pretty much, like, the whole weekend to catch up on, well, I mean, obvious stuff in the future. And naturally, I've done so many of these solo reviews, I really don't mind doing it. Plus, this was a big anticipated album for me because I've been a fan of this band since pretty much their very start. So today, we're going to go over the latest offering from Byzantine, Harbingers. This comes out on the 13th of June on Metal Blade Records. This band formed in 2000 in Charleston, West Virginia. This is their 7th album overall. I have been a fan again since the beginning with their first album, The Fundamental Component. I heard the song Sin Remover on a compilation years ago, and I mean, all the sin left my body, and then I immediately replaced it with new sins. Just kidding, all my sins are still intact. Anyway, I dug that song, picked up the album, was a big fan of their follow-up, And They Shall Take Up Serpents. And while this band has been kind of like on again, off again, like they broke up after their third album, Oblivion Beckons, and then reformed for a little bit, broke up again, and then reformed, and then started putting out albums again, and they've been really solid. And to describe this band's sound, all right, if you go in the archives, it says groove/thrash metal, which I don't think that's ever really fit with these guys. Like, yes, there are elements of thrash, and there's definitely a lot of groove, but this band's sound, I don't know, it kind of initially felt like they were kind of in that same grouping as bands like Lamb of God, but at the same time, they experimented more with like polyrhythms. The riffs were way more intricate, way more, I don't know, like proggy or techy. Like if you took Lamb of God and then mixed it with like early Meshuggah, like talking like the first 3 Meshuggah albums, and like a touch of Gojira and A Life Once Lost, you kind of have their sound overall, or at least their sound kind of in the past, because this is a little bit different. Yes, it still packs groove. Yes, there are still thrashy riffs. It is still very syncopated, lots of like fun polyrhythmic stuff and, you know, clever transitions, off-time rhythms, and a hefty dose of chug. But this album, I would say, is kind of them pushing a little bit in a different direction, and that direction is a little bit more proggy. Now, again, I've always thought this band's sound was like a little bit progressive. Like, it just didn't neatly fit into the groove metal or thrash metal or even like metalcore, you know, kind of realm. Like, it was just sort of like this weird outlier band that just came up with like absolutely clever, catchy riffs and, you know, packed a heavy punch. Their subject matter and themes were a little bit more heady, I would say, too. A lot of socio-political commentary, stuff on religion, the whole like human condition, and occasionally aliens, I guess, too, because why the fuck not? But listening to the singles in this album, I definitely detected that this was going to be a little bit different of an album, and it most definitely was. This definitely experiments way more with melody, whereas, you know, Oblivion Beckons was definitely a more melodic turn for them initially in their first 3 album run. That one still maintained a lot of like thrashy, harsh energy. It was still gritty. It was still snarling at times. This kind of pumps the brakes maybe a little bit on the heaviness and explores more atmosphere, melody. Frontman and guitarist Chris Ojeda, I'm not sure I'm saying your last name right, and I'm sorry if I'm not. His vocals have always been very distinct, and he's had a good balance of like big roars and clean vocals, and that is definitely on display here, but this definitely favors clean vocals more than I thought it would. In fact, right from the rip with Consequentia, you get these lush, pretty, you know, acoustic guitars. It's a really beautiful melody. And then clean vocals right away, and they start getting harmonized. Honestly, kind of sounds Alice in Chains-ish, but like, you know, Jerry kind of taking like the forefront a little bit more than, say, Lane or William in terms of like modern output. But that opening track transitions right into A Place We Cannot Be. I think that's what I wrote there. My handwriting is a little bit sloppy this time. Fun off-time groove. You know, big chuggy guitars. It's melodic, but it's still intense. And again, clean vocals kind of come in first before any harsh vocals do. In fact, harsh vocals are kind of the lesser thing on this opening track. But what you do get a lot of is, again, more melody. Frequently, this band, you know, relied on these big syncopated chugs. And of course, they're on here because that is a hallmark of this band's sound. But when it came down to like the melodic aspects, it usually just kind of came down to like harmonizing the riffs a little bit. When it came down to atmosphere, it usually came down to like atmospheric breaks with like tribal percussion, like cleaner playing, but then it would kind of get right back to business with the chuggy syncopation. Here, It feels like one guitar is just kind of dead set on that hefty chug and keeping that syncopation going. And again, great drum work, great rhythm work. You know, this band is fucking tight as hell. But the lead guitars are generally supplying more like atmospheric melodies. This sounds very lush and very clean. The production here was done by Peter Wickers, formerly of Soilwork, and he gave this like a very, I don't know, like pristine sound. Like it's still heavy, it's still bitey, but it is kind of missing a lot of the grit that was on like their earlier albums, and even maybe some of the more recent ones too. This is very polished, but there's also a lot of like open space on this album, and they generally fill it with a lot of like cool, clean playing. Occasionally you get like some synths and interesting effects that pop up to add a little bit to the atmosphere. Floating Chrysanthema opens up with these very sci-fi tinged synths before it gets down to, you know, kind of a straightforward, just kind of thrashy, mid-tempo sort of like chugathon before breaking into like these gallop syncopated chugs, which this band is definitely known for. There's even some interesting robotic vocal filters that show up on the Clockmaker's Intention to kind of give it, again, like kind of a sci-fi theme. Again, these guys talk about aliens. I think this kind of fits a little bit. Also, there's a song in here called Kobayashi Maru, which if you're a Star Trek fan, you know what that is. And if you're not, it's, well, a no-win situation that Captain Kirk cheated on. And I'm not talking about some green chick that he bed down on some weird planet. Just watch Wrath of Khan. Great movie. It'll explain it all. But this album kind of like took a little bit to get down to like the more intense feral moments that I kind of expected from this band. When you get down to like the title track and Riddance, it's notably a little bit more aggressive, more fast-paced, a little bit more in-your-face too. That sort of intensity is definitely dialed back on here, at least in comparison to other albums. Again, there's a lot more clean playing, and again, this feels more like a push to prog. It isn't as though this band is abandoning their sound, like all the hallmarks of their sound are still here, but the shift more towards melodic passages, but not like traditionally structured songs. Like, yeah, you do get like a lot of like verse chorus stuff in here, but there's a lot of elaborate bridges, really clever transitions that would seem out of place on, you know, just a band trying to like, I don't know, like write something hella accessible for the radio or something. I mean, if they play metal on the radio, I don't know. I don't listen to fucking radio anymore. And there are points in here where I think they definitely excel at both sides of the sound, both this like newer-ish kind of like proggier direction and kind of that old sound that, you know, I think was just absolutely awesome. The Unattainable Sleep, one of the singles on this album, I think is honestly one of the best songs on this album, and maybe up there with like one of the best songs this band has ever written. You have more of those like big bending, lurching riffs. The rhythms are like a little bit off, like really cool kick patterns, but it also embraces like, you know, a lot of the proggy tropes. This song has like one of the best bridges this band has ever written, and it is rightfully dominated by an amazing lead. The lead work with this band, I think, has always been awesome. Very thrashy, lots of shreddy leads, but also very tuneful and melodic. This one kind of breaks into this just fun syncopated gallop, and they just let the lead guitarist go wild. And I mean, honestly, there are moments that kind of remind me a little bit of Marty Friedman in there. But across the board on this album, the lead work's awesome. But that was something I honestly expected because it's something I can say about every single one of their albums. There's some cool extra percussion in the song too. Like there's a point where I think I hear like maracas. There's some really fun cymbal accents. And there's also a good balance in the vocals. Chris is doing his growls too, but there's a cleaner chorus. And Chris has this, you know, interesting range. I know, at least in terms of like talking to fans of this band, Chris's vocals can be kind of a deal breaker with some. I personally think they're awesome. The guy has like a really interesting range, and his delivery is very distinct. In between the growls and the clean singing, he has this kind of like tuneful roar, which is, you know, kind of odd sounding, but he does it in key, and he can also do a vibrato with it, which I think is really cool. But yeah, he kind of does a little bit of everything on this song, and I think it's, again, like a fantastic piece of work that kind of sits in between the past and present in terms of this band's sound. Because again, I would argue that the present is definitely more progressive and definitely more melodic, and again, that kind of takes over a good chunk of this album. Well, I think it's well executed. Like, everyone's performances on here are really solid. I kind of miss the grit. I kind of miss the intensity. It definitely shows up in pockets in here, but I don't know, it does feel like it is missing some intensity on here. Baseline, like the album feels restrained in one sense and then more expansive in another. Almost to the point where I feel like this is like a fork in the road moment here where, the next album they could choose to pursue the more proggy stuff, get more lavish, more melodic. There's points in here where honestly it kind of reminded me of like, Queensryche's more like modern output, but there's still enough of their like older sound on here where they could kind of just go right back to it. And honestly, this would just kind of be viewed as, a more experimental album. So this was kind of not exactly what I was expecting overall, but I still thought it was pretty solid. There were a couple of songs that really didn't grab me as much, like the closer Irene, which, features again like Alice in Chains harmonies, and it starts off very soft and very ballad-esque. And honestly, I kind of expected it to stay that way, but it kind of just got into like a heavier, like more groove-laden song, which at that point was already something that, kind of popped up on the album and really didn't add too much to the album. If it had stayed a ballad, honestly, it was doing pretty well. I think the vocal harmonies on that song were particularly good. And some of the transitions in the Clockmaker's Intention I thought were just, I don't know, like a little bit off. But overall, I thought this was a pretty decent album. And honestly, it's cool the band is still trying to broaden their horizons this long in their career. This was an 8-year break between their last album too. And again, it kind of makes me wonder what the next one will sound like too. So I don't know. Overall, I'm going to go with a 3.5. I dug this for the most part. I think, the riff work is still solid. The more proggy melodic direction here, I think works for the most part. Again, I do kind of miss that more like ravenous, snarling bite that the band had, at least on their like previous albums, especially those first two. And those did include a lot of melodic parts as well too. So I don't know. I feel like this band is definitely branching out their sound a little bit, but there's still enough like familiar ground in here where like old school fans will still totally recognize it as Byzantine. The riffy syncopation is always fun with this band. And again, scorching lead work across the board on this entire album. That was honestly one of my favorite parts on here. That, and well, I gotta make a Star Trek reference, which that's pretty damn cool. Yeah, if you're a big fan of, again, like early Meshuggah, I would say like, the cutoff is probably like Chaos Sphere. Definitely Gojira, definitely a little bit of Lamb of God, maybe like even some Shadows Fall that pops up on here too. Kind of all those things whirled in a blender, and then add some like toolish proggy stuff in there too to kind of make it a little bit weirder, and you'll have this. And yeah, if any of that sounds good, check this out. So, if you enjoyed this review, give it a thumbs up, and if you were new to the channel, subscribe, because we do stuff like this all the time. We also have memberships. They are only 99 cents, and our lone perk is doing a members-only live stream, which we will figure out a time to do one of those. Again, we're still recovering from MDF. The burn on my foot is almost entirely recovered now. Either way, memberships are the main way to support the channel. We also still have our store, thrallsmetal.com, with our hats and shirts. That is linked down below. And there's also a join button down there for you to hit so we can talk about all the weird shit that this band likes to talk about, especially the aliens. The alien stuff could be fun. And of course, thank you guys so much for liking, subscribing, following, all of that stuff. It means the world to us. Again, it still blows me away that this channel has grown as much as it has. Again, probably more than it rightfully should have. This is very irresponsible of you guys. You're just contributing to a bunch of degenerates. Fun degenerates, at least, I hope. But yeah, you guys absolutely roll. Tons of content coming in the future. So one more big thank you, because you guys are awesome, and we will catch you later.